But for us, really, the big time was when we went to record Aqualung. And I think whether it was just before or just after that, we did an American tour where we actually made the break from being a kind of small, like a club band and theatre band, to playing the stadiums, which in the case of America we were able to do thanks to Led Zeppelin, who were at the time carving their way as a major act in the country, and we were allowed or able to be their support band on stage, which meant going on for 35 minutes and going absolutely crazy, whilst they of course had to play an hour and a half show or something. So we were able to do a lot in that tour with Zeppelin, to getting ourselves a reputation for being a fairly sort of wild and exciting live act, which in 35 minutes, I mean, anyone can do. If you only got 35 minutes to do, you can go bananas for that period of time and make it look great. But that was really how we got off the ground. So I think by the time we came to doing Aqualung, we were, certainly by the time we were playing that on stage and the album was released, we were then established as just about as a stadium band in our own right. We were playing the smaller stadiums and indeed some of the bigger ones. And I think we in our turn became the host to Yes, who were one of our early support bands. Ironically, though, they had a hit single at the time and we didn't have a hit anything. But they were our support band. They were good. But it took a long time really to establish. I think probably 2 years before we established ourselves really in the kind of circuit that we've been able to play in since then in the States.
Benefit, which was released in 1970, and then the following year Aqualung in 71, was a turning point in Britain, because Benefit failed to succeed here.
Well, yeah, I mean,
in America, and it was the
well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, everything has failed to succeed here since the very first album, basically, because we've never played more than a few dates in Britain since 1969. I think we might have done a sort of a tour in 69, but not that much. We basically have just done a few dates every year since, and sometimes only one date or two dates. Possibly one year we didn't do any at all, I can't remember, but really we have ignored Britain, and primarily I suppose because there was so much demand to go elsewhere, because we just were more successful in the US and we were more successful in Germany and Scandinavia and so on than we could have been here. But also there seemed little point in spending huge amounts of time working in Britain, because everything we earned was taxable at the highest possible rate, and therefore from the point of view of earning money it wasn't particularly attractive. And also pretty early on we started to get the feeling that we weren't really liked. I always got the feeling I wasn't really liked very much by the British press, and that kind of put me off a bit. And I mean, really, apart from that sort of, I don't know, 20,000-30,000 people in Britain who sort of do follow the band, do buy the records and come to the concerts. I mean, it's a very solid following. I mean, I would say our British fans are as most, as at least as reliable and solid and stay with you as any elsewhere in the world. I mean, they're a very good and reliable bunch. They always give you the benefit of the doubt, and I'm indebted to that number of people for at least encouraging us in Britain whenever we play. But it's always been that of that order. I don't think Jethro Tull. It's a bit like carrying coals to Newcastle, because we've always had this kind of slightly sort of ethnic British kind of a sound about us, and it's not ultimately what's popular in this country. I mean, utilising elements of folk music and classical music as well as the blues and the rock and roll has made us seem, perhaps by the standards of the British music scene, to be a bit quaint or a bit archaic. And that I can understand, but it's scarcely important when you weigh up some of the other stuff that's around. I think there's always room for a band like us to be somewhere on the periphery of it all. We've never been mainstream pop or mainstream rock and roll. We've always been on the edge of it, and successful in spite of the trends and in spite of fashion, not because of it. So our success now and in the future really depends on, the continuance of that kind of adopting that little area for ourselves that's very much on the edge of whatever else is going on. It's always been that way over here, and I'm sure it will be as long as we carry on.
Back to Aqualung now, that was a time of change in the group and also a time of change in the music. Perhaps you could talk about that. John Evans, Glenn Cornick, and the fact that Aqualung itself was perhaps the first excursion that you had made into the idea of a concept album.
Well, Aqualung wasn't a concept album any more than Broadsword is a concept album. It's just a collection of songs like all the others, and with the exception of Thick as a Brick and Passion Play, which were musically sort of put together in one kind of big, broad area of continuous music. Really all the albums have been not concept albums, and Aqualung wasn't a concept album either. It was just that, rather like Broadsword, for example, having achieved an acceptable 10 songs or whatever to put on a record, you then look and see what are the common denominators musically and lyrically that tie it all together, and you try and home in on those when it comes to doing the album cover design, the publicity, the titling of it, the whole sort of the way you talk about the album. You try and give it some identity. You try and give all the songs some unity so they hang together as an album and not just 10 songs. And really Aqualung was like that. The notion of its being a concept album was something that was really quite retrospective. We gave it that sort of identity, but it wasn't. I never went around saying it was a concept album, and it was, rather like Sgt. Pepper. It's the same sort of thing. There's a bunch of songs decorated with a cover that gave the whole thing some credibility, and people said it was a concept. I don't know what the concept was, if there was one.
The character that had been created in Aqualung, it was the concept and not necessarily the songs themselves.
Well, to me, a concept album, or the name, concept album, suggests that someone has sat down before making the record and calculated an overall effect for the record, whether it's dealing with, whether it's got a storyline or whether all the songs are related in some very positive ways. It suggests that it was done before the album was made, and certainly in the case of Aqualung it wasn't. Certainly in the case of all the albums other than Thick as a Brick and Passion Play, it certainly wasn't. I don't really think, I haven't actually discussed this with George Martin, but I wouldn't think that he would say Sgt. Pepper was a I don't think there was any deliberate attempt beforehand to arrive at this notion of guys in sort of band coats and this kind of slightly surrealistic sort of, marching band sort of atmosphere, the sort of strange. I don't think that was a preconceived thing at all. I think concept albums was always an overworked term, but I think totally misguided in a lot of cases. Whereas things like, if you like, Jesus Christ Superstar, that is a concept album. The Wall is a concept album. But Aqualung, I don't really think is a concept album at all.
The changes in the group.
Well, Jethro Tull's had its, at least its fair share of musical changes, but I think it's always best seen in the perspective of the pre-Jethro Tull identity. The John Evan Band, consisted of a certain number of people who split up immediately prior to Jethro Tull's forming, and then after the initial version of Jethro Tull faded away, Clive Bunker and Glenn Cornick and Mick Abrahams, the members of the previous band sort of came back into Jethro Tull, and the extraneous figures, if you like, are David Palmer, who actually worked on even the very first album. He was involved in doing some arrangements for, a few session players, orchestral players on that album, and right the way through. So he's sort of been involved right since the beginning and became a proper member of the band for 2 or 3 albums in the late 70s, early 80s. And, other than that, the only regular changes we've had is from bass players, and not because they were pushed, but because they left. Glenn Cornick left to form his own band. I mean, he wasn't entirely pushed. Jeffrey Hammond was, very much resigned. I mean, nobody wanted him to leave. He just decided that he'd had enough of being a musician and wanted to go back to painting. So he left, and John Glasscock, who followed him, died, through a heart disease, which had always been with him, but he didn't know about it, sort of thing. After that, the next guy was Temporary, and then after that was Dave Pegg. So, I mean, really only in the bass player department have there been a lot of changes. The most recent changes are for entirely different reasons and due to a bit of a mix-up over the identity of the album A. And that's really the only area of any sour feeling in the group, is of the changes in 1980 or thereabouts. Other than that, I mean, I don't think there's been as many changes as there appear. It's rather like you've got a family of people who have been in and out of Jethro Tull, or certainly have been in and out of an involvement with playing with me over a number of years. And they're the only people I played with. There haven't been too many strangers in the band, as it were. There's kind of this, family of people that most of whom I played with since I was 15 years old.